was, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? For those of you who are new to the topic, the background is fairly easy to sketch in. November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly decides to resolve this conflict in Palestine. We're going to divide it roughly in half between Jews and Arabs. Immediately upon the UN resolution being passed, a conflict breaks out within Palestine. By May 1948, when Israel declares its statehood, it becomes an interstate conflict with neighboring Arab states. At the end of the war, roughly 750,000 Palestinians find themselves outside their homes. And the question always arose, how did those 750,000 Palestinians, how did they end up refugees? And the standard argument that Israel put forth, and as I said, was probably widely believed up until roughly the late 1980s, the argument was that the Arab armies stood poised on the border of Palestine, ready to invade, transmitted these radio messages, broadcasts to the Palestinians in Palestine to leave their homes, clear the field for the invading Arab armies, and after they successfully threw the Jews into the sea, then the Palestinians would be able to return to their homes. How many people are familiar with that explanation of what happened in 1948? Well, the older people must surely, because that was standard. And until the late 1980s, as I said, that was pretty much what everybody believed. And then in the late 80s, a number of Israeli historians in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, Israeli historians started going through the record from the Israeli archival point of view. And the main person who went through the record is a fellow named Benny Morris. And Benny Morris concludes, to use his language, not my own, that what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. And there's now, you could say, a broad consensus among historians that exactly that, what happened in 1948, was the indigenous population of Palestine, at any rate in the area that became Israel, was ethnically cleansed. Now, it's not true to say no debate continues, but the debate is now within fairly narrow parameters. The debate now is, was this ethnic cleansing premeditated, intentional, methodical, or was it an accident of war? Everybody knows wars generate refugees, and maybe these refugees were simply a byproduct of a war. And to show you or to illustrate how narrow this debate has become, you take the case of Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, a very smart guy. He's a historian by training, and a reasonably honest fellow for sure. He wrote a couple of years ago a book called Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, part of which went through the history of the conflict. And of course, he had to address the refugee question. And he says, well, yeah, it was an ethnic cleansing in 1948, but the former foreign minister says, I don't really agree with Benny Morris, Morris being one of the proponents of the notion that it was an accident of war. No, says the former foreign minister, I don't really agree with that. It wasn't an accident of war. It was quite clearly premeditated, intentional, methodical. As he puts it, it was anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer, transfer being the euphemism back then for expulsion. And so now you have the case of a former foreign minister, incidentally not an ancient former foreign minister. He was the Israeli foreign minister in 2000 during the Camp David negotiations. Even a former foreign minister and trained historian acknowledges it was not just an ethnic cleansing, but it was a premeditated ethnic cleansing anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer. Apart from the question of the refugees, probably the question that looms largest or is most most in the public eye is the question of these wars that Israel has endured with its neighbors since its founding in 1948. And certainly it's a large number of wars, 48, 56, 67, the Canal War, 68 to 70, 73, 82, and then the two intifadas. And the conventional wisdom is, as Israelis like to say, with the possible exception of the 1982 war, the war in Lebanon, these were all wars of no choice wars. But that's not really what the record any longer shows. You take the case of a very excellent book. I highly recommend it. I certainly put it above my own, by Ze'ev Maoz. It's called Defending the Holy Land. Maoz is the former director of Israel's Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's a very smart guy, and obviously he held a prestigious position. That's their Israel's most distinguished Center for Strategic Studies. And he's written a very fat book. It's probably around 800 pages. It's interesting, not in any way to denigrate the book. I think the book is an excellent book. But just to put it in perspective, the book is mostly a synthesis of what all other scholars have written on the topic. It's mostly a synthesis of what you call, in scholarly language, of the monographic literature. He takes it all and tries to figure out, okay, what does it all show? Obviously, time doesn't allow me to go through those 800 pages, but it's not without interest to just listen to his conclusions. So he says, or concludes, Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. None of the wars, none, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, none was a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. The only possible exception, he says, and as I was actually interested, he qualifies it, the only possible exception is maybe 48. He goes on to say, Israel's decision makers were as reluctant and risk-averse when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels. When Israel was willing to take risks for peace, these usually paid off. The Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated formal and informal agreements. Again, an opinion diametrically at odds with the conventional or mainstream wisdom. 67 wasn't a war of necessity. 73, the so-called Yom Kippur War, not a war of necessity. The only possible exception is 48. Now bear in mind, under international law, if it wasn't a war of necessity, which is defined very stringently, a war of necessity is when you are the object of an armed attack. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. In any other case, it's a war of aggression. And even Mr. Maoz is clear in that. He says a war of choice is just a euphemism for a war of aggression. All of the wars, with the possible exception of 48, says Mr. Maoz, were effectively wars of aggression by Israel. Well, what about the present?